They say the forest has eyes, that the deeper you go, the more it watches. Have you ever felt it, that eerie sensation of being followed when no one else is there? Some say it's just your mind playing tricks on you. But in the vast ancient forests of Slavic folklore there's another explanation, one with roots as deep as the trees themselves. Today on the LoreKeepers Library we're peeling back the dense canopy of legend to uncover the truth about the Leshy, the elusive, mischievous and often terrifying guardian of the wild. If you think you know the forest, think again, because in his domain, the path you take may not be the one that leads you home. Welcome to the LoreKeepers Library, the podcast where myths, legends and folklore aren't just told, they're explored, questioned and sometimes completely turned on their heads. I'm Chris, your guide through the shadowy corners of history and the stories that refuse to be forgotten. Now today's episode is one for the wanderers, the hikers and maybe even the occasional lost soul. We're diving deep into the folklore that is the Leshy, the Slavic forest spirit who doesn't just watch over the woods, he owns them. Being of shapeshifting, playful mischief, and sometimes terrifying wrath, the Leshy has haunted Eastern European legends for centuries. Is he a protector, a trickster, a villain? Maybe all three. Before we get too deep into the trees, take a moment to like and subscribe and join our growing archive of folklore enthusiasts. Every time you engage with this podcast, you help keep these stories alive just as they're meant to be. After all, what is a library without its keepers? Deep in the heart of the Slavic wilderness, where the forests stretch for miles, where the trees whisper in a language older than memory, there is something watching. It moves unseen, felt only in the sudden hush of the wind, in the shifting shadows. It is not a god, nor a demon, it is something older. It is the Leshy. To understand the Leshy, you have to understand the forests of Slavic lands, the vast untamed wilderness that once covered what is now Russia, Ukraine, Poland, Belarus and the Baltic regions. These were not gentle woods, they were deep and dark and unpredictable. Paths could vanish, landmarks could shift, what seemed safe one moment could become treacherous to the next. In the minds of the people who lived at the edge of these forests, such chaos could not exist without a master. The Leshy was that master. It was not a mere inhabitant of the wood, but the very essence of them. He was not just a spirit lurking in the trees, he was the trees. The groaning of the branches, the sigh of the wind through the leaves, the sudden rustling when no animal was near, all of it, his presence. In some villages, he was feared as a trickster, a keeper of lost souls who allured the unwary to their dooms. In others, he was respected as a guardian, the one who decided whether a hunter would return with food or vanish without a trace. But always, he was acknowledged, because to ignore the Leshy was to risk his attention, and no one wanted that. So where does the name Leshy come from? The name Leshy comes from the Old Slavic root les, meaning forest. He is literally the one of the woods, the being of the wild, and yet he has many names. In Poland he is sometimes called Borowy, meaning pine forest. In Serbia he is Lesnik, a direct translation of forest keeper, and in some Russian folklore he is simply known as Kozyen Lesha, the master of the forest. But names are only what humans give to the things that they can understand. To the forest itself, it was something else entirely, a force beyond language, older than any word carved in stone. The Leshy is a spirit, but not one that we may think of. He is not a ghost of the dead, nor a god to be worshipped. Instead, he is something that exists between the physical and the unseen, a being tied to the land, shifting with the seasons. Some stories say that in spring and summer, he is strong, lush and full of life, able to take on the form of a tall, powerful man with bark-like skin and leaves woven into his hair. But in the fall and winter, when the trees grow bare, so does he, his power fading, his body becoming smaller, more fragile, almost skeletal. Others claim that the Leshy is not a single entity, but a title, a role filled by many spirits who rule different forests. A traveller might be hunted by one Leshy in the pines of Russia, only to find another guardian in the oak groves of Poland. And yet their nature remains the same. They are the will of the woods, the boundary between men and the untamed wild. Despite his shifting nature, one thing remains constant. The Leshy is the guardian of the forest, and humans enter his realm at their risk. His role is not to be good or evil. Such concepts belong to men, not to the wild. Instead, he is the balance, ensuring that nature is neither exploited nor forgotten. A hunter who takes only what he needs, who respects the land, may find that the Leshy is an ally, guiding him to game, keeping storms at bay, ensuring he finds his way home. But a hunter who kills for greed, who spills blood without gratitude, he may vanish amongst the trees, never to be seen again. Farmers near the woods knew to leave small offerings of bread or salt at the forest's edge, a sign of respect to the unseen master within. And travellers were wise to speak softly, never to whistle or call out a name too loudly, because the Leshy might answer. And if he did, well, you may not like what you heard. There is a border between the known and the unknown. To the Slavic people, the world was not simply land and sky, man and beast. There was something else, a thin, fragile border where the ordinary and the supernatural touched. The forest was that border, and the Leshy was the one who guarded it. He could help you or hinder you, trick or protect you. He could appear as a man, a tree, or even a shadow flitting beyond your sight. He was always there, watching and waiting, reminding those who enter his domain of one simple truth. The forest does not belong to you. It never has. So if you step beneath the ancient boughs and feel the hush fall around you, if the trees seem to lean in just a little closer as though to be listening, tread carefully, speak softly, and never take more than you need, because the Leshy is always watching, and he does not forget. When you step into the forest, you might not see him at first, but he is there, watching and waiting, hidden in the sway of the trees, in the shifting patterns of the leaves, in the stillness that settles when birds suddenly stop singing. The Leshy does not always reveal himself, but when he does, he is never quite what you expect. The Leshy is not made of flesh and bone the way we are. He is a creature of bark and moss, of shadow and wind, as much part of the forest as the trees themselves. When seen in his true form, he appears as a tall, humanoid figure, towering over any man, his body covered in rough, bark-like skin that shifts in the colour with the seasons. In the spring and summer he is lush and green, his hair thick with leaves, his beard tangled with vines, his eyes glinting like sunlight through the canopy. But as autumn arrives, so does change. His skin cracks like dry wood, his hair turns brittle, his voice becomes the rustles of falling leaves, and in the winter he is at his weakness, thin and skeletal, pale as frost, barely more than a shadow among the bare branches. Some say his eyes glow an eerie green like fireflies in the darkness. Others claim they are deep and hollow, endless as the woods themselves, as if looking into them might pull you somewhere they could never return from. But perhaps the most unsettling of all was his smile, wide, sharp, and not quite human. And if you see it, it's too late. You may never leave this forest again. One of the most unsettling things about the Leshy is that he's never looked the same twice. He shifts and distorts, his size changes as easily as the wind moves through the trees. At the forest's edge he might seem like an ordinary man dressed in a hunter's cloak, a hood shadowing his face. But step deeper into the domain, you might notice something strange. His footprints are suddenly too large, his shadow stretching unnaturally across the forest floor. And then, if you dare to look again, you realise he is no longer the size of a man. In the stories told by hunters and lost travellers, the Leshy's height depends on its surroundings. In an open clearing he might appear small, no taller than the grass around him, but in the depths of the forest, where the trees loom tall and endless, he stretches with them, growing taller and broader until he is as vast as the canopy itself. Some legends say that his head always reaches the highest treetops no matter where he stands. Others claim that he walks among humans. He can shrink to the size of a child, his piercing gaze the only thing portraying what he truly is. And then of course there are the tales of those who saw him not as a man, but as something else entirely. A towering shadow that flickers between the trees, a shifting figure that seems to move with the wind, always at the edge of sight but never fully seen. And for those unlucky enough to see the Leshy up close, there is something deeply unsettling about his features. At first glance he might seem like a man in the woods, an old hermit, a wanderer with a thick beard and wild hair. But look closer, and the wrongness becomes clear. His eyes are too sharp, too bright, burning with the wild intelligence that is nothing like human thought. His skin, rough and textured, feels more like tree bark than flesh. His hands, when they reach out, are long and gnarled, not quite fingers, not quite branches, but something in between. And then there is his mouth, the grin that is too wide, too full of teeth, the kind of smile that doesn't belong to something that should smile at all. Some say he can speak, but the voice is never the same twice. Sometimes it is deep as thunder, rumbling like the distant storms. Other times it is the whisper of the wind through the leaves, the creaking of old wood, and the soft laughter of something hidden just beyond sight. And if you hear it call your name, you must never answer. The Leshy is not bound to one form. He is a creature of the wild, and the wild is always changing. He can take the shape of an ordinary traveller, his footprints blending seamlessly with your own. He might appear as a huntsman, guiding you deeper into the woods, his face always just hidden enough that you never quite see him fully. Or he might not look like a man at all. Some tales say he becomes the trees themselves, his face appearing in the gnarled knots of the ancient trunks, his laughter rustling through the branches. Others whisper that he can take on the form of animals, a great black wolf with glowing green eyes, an impossibly tall elk that stands among the trees, a massive owl that watches without blinking. But no matter his shape, there is always something off. The hunter who followed a strangely tall man with no shadow, the traveller who saw a bear walk on two legs just a little too smoothly, and the woodcutter who swore the tree he felled bled like a living thing. All of these are warnings, they are signs, and all of them are too late. In some stories, the Leshy does not appear at all, not as a man, not as a beast, not as a tree. Instead, he is a presence, a feeling that shifts in the air that makes the hair on your arms raise, the sense that something is watching, even when you're alone. You feel him in the way the path suddenly seems unfamiliar, twisting in ways it's never done before. You hear him in the laughter that does not belong to any man, in the voices that echo your own, calling from deep within the trees. He is there, just to the edges of your sight, never seen fully, never understood completely. And that's what makes him so terrifying, because how do you fight something that you truly cannot see? All in all, the Leshy is not a man. He is not a creature to be reasoned with, nor a beast to be hunted. He does not belong to the world of villages and cities, of roads and maps. He is the forest himself, wild and untamed. He does not bow to human rules, nor do you expect humans to understand his. And so, those who enter his domain must tread carefully, because the Leshy is watching, and he does not forget. There's a reason people feared the deep forests. They weren't just dark and full of wolves, they were alive, shifting and watching. And at the heart of the watchfulness was the Leshy. Unlike many spirits in the Slavic folklore, he was not tied to specific places, a river, a home, or a grave. The Leshy was the forest itself. He wasn't bound to a single tree or a hidden cave. He moved where the roots ran deep and the shadows thickened, and that meant his interaction with humans were unpredictable as the wildness he was ruling. Would he help you, trick you, or lead you so far into the trees that you'd forget the sound of your own name? And the Leshy wasn't evil, not in the way of demons or malevolent spirits were, but he wasn't good either. He was wild, and that's what made him dangerous. To those who treated the forest with respect, he could be a benevolent guide. Hunters who left offerings, bits of bread, salt, or even a few drops of vodka might find that game was suddenly plentiful. The paths through the woods strangely easily to follow. If travellers spoke kindly of the Leshy, acknowledging his presence, he might lead them safely through the tangled undergrowth, ensuring they reached their destination unscathed. But if you disrespected the forest, that was a different story entirely. The Leshy loved mischief, and if you failed to honour him, or worse, harm his domain, he had ways of making sure you regretted it. He was known for leading travellers astray, shifting the trees when no one was looking, so the paths twisted back on themselves, and no matter which way you turned, you only found yourself deeper and deeper into the woods. The further you walked, the quieter everything became. No birds, no wind, just your own breath, loud in the suffocating stillness. And that's when you knew you weren't lost, you were being watched. Some stories claim that the only way to escape was to turn your clothes inside out, wear your shoes backwards, a trick to confuse the Leshy and throw off his sense of direction. Others say that if you spoke your own name backwards, you could break his hold over you, But not everyone was lucky enough to remember these tricks before it was too late, because sometimes the Leshy didn't just want to confuse you, sometimes he wanted to keep you. There are countless tales of children who wandered too far into the woods and were never seen again. Some say the Leshy took them as their own, raising them deep in the forest until they became part of the wild itself. And if these children ever returned, they were different. Not in the way of supernatural swaps or eerie doppelgangers or changelings, but in the way that someone who has seen too much or walked too far from home could never quite return to who they once were. They spoke less, their eyes held a knowing look as if they had learned something ancient and untamed that could never be put into words. They walked with an uncanny ease through the trees and never stumbled, and they were never lost. Some claimed these children could even speak with animals, understand the rustling of leaves as if the forest whispered just for them. And in the dead of night, when the wind howled through the trees, some parents swore they heard the children laughing softly to themselves, as if they still heard the voice of someone calling to them from the woods. There are tales, unsettling ones, of people who wandered too far into the forest and heard laughter. Not the soft laughter of a friend or a child, but something deep, rolling and unnatural, like the wind through hollow branches. If you heard it once, you might dismiss it. If you heard it again, closer this time, you ran. Because when the Leshy laughed, it meant he had taken an interest in you. Other stories tell of travellers hearing voices, familiar voices calling their names from just beyond the trees. Some believed it was a loved one looking for them. Some even swore they saw a familiar face just out of the reach, beckoning deeper into the woods. But those who followed rarely returned, and if they did, they were different. Dazed, quiet, their memories full of holes, their dreams haunted by trees that seemed to whisper. What had they seen? What had they spoken to? Some said the Leshy had taken something from them, and just a sliver of their soul, just enough to leave them changed. But for all of his tricks, the Leshy wasn't without reason. He could be bargained with and even befriended if you knew how to approach him. Respect was the key. Hunters who sought his blessing before stepping into the woods, poured a drink on the ground, left an offering, or whispered words of gratitude, often found their hunts were successful and their paths clear. There were even stories of people who became true friends with Leshy, learning his ways, understanding his rules. These rare individuals were sometimes even given gifts, a piece of bark that never caught fire, a feather that leapt and moved unseen, a handful of dirt that always led them home. But no matter how kind the Leshy seemed, one thing was always true. You never outstayed your welcome. You never tried to control the forest or claim it as your own, because the Leshy was a force of nature, and nature does not bow to man. So, if you ever find yourself deep in the woods and the path ahead seems to twist when you're not looking, if the wind carries a sound that's almost not quite like laughter, walk carefully, speak kindly, and whatever you do, do not follow the voices. Because once the Leshy sets his sights on you, you might never find your way back. So, we've established that the Leshy is the ruler of the forest, but does he rule alone? Is he some lone guardian lurking among the trees with only the rustling leaves for company? Or does he have a family? Or does he have a court of strange woodland beings that exist alongside him? Many folklores can't quite agree. Some say he's a solitary trickster, appearing only when he feels like causing mischief. Others insist he has a wife, children, and even animal companions, a whole hidden world existing deep within the forest, just out of the human sight. But as always, when it comes to the Leshy, things are never that simple. Now here's where things take an interesting turn. The Leshy is often described as a male figure, but some legends whisper about the Lesha Chica, a female counterpart. Who is she? Well, that depends on the version of the story you hear. Some say in simple the female form of the Leshy, appearing when the forest needs balance. Others claim she is his actual wife, though her personality and role in folklore are far more elusive than her husband's. She does not play tricks on travellers, nor does she lure hunters into the depths of the woods. Instead, she is a shadowy, quiet figure, always there but never fully seen. There are tales of her appearing as a pale woman dressed in white, her hair tangled with leaves and moss, watching from a distance. Some even claim she was once human, a woman taken by the Leshy and transformed into the spirit of the forest, her old life lost to the whispering trees. And this is where things get even stranger. What if the Lesha Chica was never separate being at all? Some scholars suggest that these stories of female Leshy are actually just another example of his shape-shifting nature. If the Leshy can take on the form of a beast, giant, or children, what's to stop him from appearing as a woman when it suits him? Perhaps, in some eerie way, Leshyjika is another trick of the forest. If the Leshy and the Leshyjika exist as a pair, then naturally stories of their offspring, the Leshonki. Now these little creatures are rarely mentioned in folklore, but when they do appear, they're often described as small shadowy figures with glowing eyes darting between the trees, always watching. Unlike their father, whose tricks can range from playful to terrifying, the Leshonki are mostly harmless, but that doesn't mean they won't cause a little trouble. They love leaving travellers in circles, mimicking voices and hiding objects just to see the confused look on the human faces. Some even say that if you hear the sound of children laughing deep in the woods, when you know there shouldn't be any children nearby, well, that might just be the Leshonki playing their games. But their origins are just as mysterious as their fathers. Are they really his children, or are they simply lesser spirits of the forest spouting like saplings from his influence? Some tales even claim they are stolen human children, transformed into woodland tricksters, and are forever lost in the maze of trees. Whatever they are, one thing is certain, they are never far behind their father. But not all of the Leshy's companions are spirits. In many stories he is closely tied to the creatures of the forest, ruling over them like a king with a wild, untamed court. Wolves, in particular, are said to be his chosen animal. Some legends even claim that wolves exist because of him, that the first wolf was created by the Leshy himself, shaped from the shadows of the forest and the whispers of the wind. And because of that, every wolf owes him a debt. If he calls, they will come, circling the trees, their glowing eyes peering through the underbrush, waiting for his command. But he isn't just tied to wolves. Some say he rides through the forest on a massive black horse with burning eyes, its hooves barely making the sound on the forest floor. Others believe he travels with a bear by his side, so that he can speak to every bird in the canopy, using their calls to send messages across the treetops. And then there are the stranger tales, the ones that claim his companions aren't entirely natural at all. Some travellers tell stories of half-formed creatures lurking at the edge of the vision, shapes that flicker like shadows but don't quite belong to any known animal. Are these spirits, ghosts, or are they something else entirely? Beings that only the Leshy himself understands. Of course, the Leshy isn't the only supernatural force in Slavic mythology. There are other beings that roam the wild places, some who may be his allies and others who might see him as a rival. One of them well known is the Vodnik, the spirit of the water. Where the Leshy rules the trees, the Vodnik lurks in lakes and rivers, watching beneath the surface with cold green eyes. Some say they respect each other, maintaining the delicate balance between land and water. Others claim they are constantly at odds, fighting control over the borderlands where the forest meets the stream. Then there's the Domovoi, the spirits of the home. Unlike the wild and unpredictable Leshy, the Domovoi is the guardian of human civilization, watching over the hearth and protecting families. Some even say that when people first left the forest to build their homes, they did so with the Domovoi's blessings, effectively choosing order over chaos, safety over the untamed wild. Does this make them enemies? Not necessarily, but it does make them opposites, and the Leshy is not known to be fond of things that contain the natural world. And then there's the Rusalka, a vengeful spirit often linked to water, sometimes a drowned woman, sometimes something far more sinister. Some say she serves the Vodnik, luring men into lakes and dragging them beneath the surface. But she also is said to have also dealings with the Leshy. Could she also be another being of the untamed world, sharing his disdain for careless humans? The connections between them are unclear, but if they ever were allies, it would be a partnership built on the eerie silence and unseen agreements. So does the Leshy have a family? A wife, children, a kingdom of wolves and spirits lurking behind him as he walks? Maybe, or maybe not. Maybe the Leshy is whatever he needs to be in that moment. A solitary trickster, a king of beasts, a father to ghostly children who never truly existed in the first place. Maybe the forest itself is his family, and every rustling leaf, every howling wolf, every twisting shadow is a part of him. Because at the end of the day, whether he is surrounded by spirits or walking alone, one thing remains the same. The forest is his, and his presence is always there, waiting just beyond the trees. So here's a question that doesn't often get asked. Why is the Leshy always a he? In nearly every story, every Slavic tale, he is referred to as a male, a lord of the forest, a master of the wild, a trickster and a guardian. But does that mean there's no female Leshys, or is there something deeper going on? Well, let's start with the basics. One big reason the Leshy is considered male comes down to linguistics. The Slavic languages, nouns have grammatical gender. The word Leshy is grammatically masculine. This means that even before you get into folklore itself, the structure of the language already frames the Leshy as male. Now that doesn't mean the Leshy is actually male in the way humans understand gender, not necessarily. Slavic folklore isn't always bound to human concepts of identity. The Leshy isn't a person, he's a forest spirit, a force of nature, something that exists outside the human norms. He takes on a male form, but it doesn't mean he is the same as a man in a village. Still, the way the people talk about the Leshy shaped how they saw him. Over time, he's subtly defined as a he in the stories passed down. Now let's take a step into the realm of cultural perception. If you look at a lot of Slavic spirits, you'll notice a pattern. Spirits tied to the home, fertility, or water tend to be female, while spirits of the wild, untamed nature, are more often male. Think about it. The Rolska, the water nymph, is female. Domovoi, the household spirit, can be both, but often skews male into a more protective role. And Baba Yaga, the famous witch, rules over the boundaries of life and death, but it still remains tied to the home. But the Leshy, he is not a guardian of hearth and home. He is wild, unpredictable, a force that men, especially hunters and travellers, had to deal with when they entered his domain. And in old Slavic societies, men were traditionally the ones who ventured into the deep forest, to hunt, to gather wood, to explore. So the stories they told weren't about maternal or nurturing forest spirits. Instead, they imagined something like them, a figure with a booming laugh, a trickster's grin, a temper that could shift as fast as the wind through the trees. Over time, this solidified the idea that the Leshy as a masculine figure, both in language and in legend. And this is where things get interesting. There are a few mentions of female counterparts to the Leshy, but they were far rarer. Some stories talk about Leshika, Leshy's wife, or even the Shonki, their children. But here's the catch, these figures aren't as deeply developed in folklore as the Leshy himself. Why? Because the stories weren't about them. The Leshy's myth comes from men encountering the unknown in the forest, so the legend focuses on him. His supposed wife or children? They exist mostly as extensions of him, not as fully independent spirits with their own myths. Some variations say that if a woman gets lost in the woods for too long, she becomes the bride of a Leshy, or even transformed into the Shika herself, but the details here are vague, scattered, and often regionally specific. So while they're hints of female Leshy, they are secondary characters, not the dominant figures in Slavic mythology. And though the Leshy might take on the form of a man, that he does not mean that he's truly male. Or is it just the shape that people understood? Some stories claim the Leshy can shapeshift into whatever form he likes, a traveller, an animal, even the shadows between the trees. If that's true, then his gender might not be fixed at all. He simply chooses to present himself as male because that is what those who enter his domain expect to see. So maybe, just maybe, the forest itself is too vast to be contained into one form, one voice, or one identity. So why does the Leshy matter? Sure, he's a trickster, a guardian, a spirit of the wilds, but why has he lasted in Slavic folklore for centuries and passed down in hushed warnings and campfire stories? The answer is simple, because the forest mattered. To the Slavic people, the forest was everything, a source of food, shelter, medicine, and even protection. It was a place of both life and death, offering safety from invaders but also hiding its own dangers. And at the heart of it all was the Leshy, the one who ruled those endless trees, the one who decided whether you left his domain safe and whole, or not at all. Unlike in modern times where forests are often seen as passive landscapes, places to hike through, photograph or exploit for resources, the ancient Slavs saw them as living, breathing entities. And in their worldview, something so vast and unpredictable had to have spirits guarding it. That spirit was the Leshy. His presence explained the unexplainable, why paths twisted when they shouldn't, why some hunters never returned, why a traveller could swear they were walking in circles even though they never changed direction. By giving the forest a face, a will, and even a personality, the Leshy made sense of the unknown. And that's important, Because in a time before compasses, before detailed maps and before GPS, when stepping in the woods could mean disappearing forever, the Leshy wasn't just a myth, he was a warning. And here's where the Leshy stands out. Unlike creatures from other myths, like werewolves, demons and witches, he isn't inherently evil. He's not there to destroy humanity or spread chaos for his own sake. The Leshy, at his core, is a guardian, not of people, not of cities or kingdoms, but the forest itself. He punishes those who take too much, who kill without reason, who step where they shouldn't. But for those who show respect, those who offer small gift before cutting wood, who only hunt what they need, he can be, well, not kind exactly, but fair. This made him a force of balance, a reminder that nature isn't just something to be used, it has rules, limits and consequences. And if you forget that, the Leshy will remind you. And here's the thing, stories don't survive for centuries unless they mean something. The Leshy wasn't just a bedtime story to scare children or a fun little folktale to pass the time. He was woven into daily life. Farmers would blame the Leshy for crops failing if the forest nearby had been disturbed. Hunters who got lost would say they had angered the Leshy by not showing proper respect. Villagers would leave offerings at the forest edges, hoping to appease him before gathering wood or mushrooms. Even today, echoes of his belief remain. There are still rural communities in Eastern Europe where certain forests are seen as off-limits or unlucky, places where people step lightly, whispering old prayers or simply avoid entirely. They might not call it the fear of the Leshy anymore, but the caution is still there. Unlike many figures of folklore who have vanished and faded into obscurity, the Leshy hasn't vanished. He's survived, shifting and adapting, lingering in whispers and tradition. Because in the end, the fear of getting lost, the respect of the wild, the belief that nature has a will of its own, those ideas never really go away. And maybe, and hopefully, that means the Leshy never does either. Now, folklore is a stubborn thing. It refuses to stay buried in the past, no matter how much we pave our forests over or swap old campfire stories for screens. The Leshy is proof of that. You might not hear hunters blaming him for getting lost anymore, and the villagers aren't leaving bits of bread at the tree line to appease him, but that doesn't mean he's gone. If anything, he's just found a new hunting ground. Because the Leshy is still out there. He's lurking in books, movies and video games, slipping between the pages of dark fantasy and horror, twisting the branches of storytelling just as he does in the forest of folklore. For a lot of people, their first encounter with the Leshy wasn't an old folktale, it was from The Witcher, a book series by Shapeshifting. The original Witcher books actually referred to a type of Leshy known as a Borovik in the Seasons of Storms. While it's not a major player in the story, its presence is a nod to the deep Slavic roots woven throughout the Witcher universe. If you've ever played Witcher 3 The Wild Hunt, you probably remember the first time you stumbled upon a Leshy, a towering gnarled creature with a stag skull for a face, moving like an ancient force of nature. In the game, he's less like the mischievous trickster and more of a terrifying embodiment of the wild, summoning crows and wolves to protect his domain. It's a twisted, monstrous take on the old stories, but the core idea remains. The Leshy guards the forests, and if you cross him, you will suffer. And The Witcher isn't alone in pulling the Leshy from the depths of folklore. In the eerie, mind-bending game Pathologic, the world feels drenched in Slavic myth. And while the Leshy itself does not appear, his influence is there, in the way nature and supernatural blur together, in the way the land itself seems to resist human control. In Golomantero's Cabinet of Curiosities, there is an episode called The Autopsy, where an ancient forest-dwelling entity preys on humans hiding within nature itself. And while it is never named as the Leshy, the themes of something lurking just beyond human understanding, watching, waiting, punishing, feel very much in his spirit. And then there's literature. The Leshy has quietly crept into modern fantasy and horror books, sometimes as a direct reference, other times as an eerie, unknowable force at the edge of civilization. Kathleen O'Neill Gear's The Ice Line explores a world where ancient spirits like the Leshy still hold sway. Emily Carroll's Through the Woods doesn't name him outright, but the unsettling, twisting forest in its gothic horror stories feels like it could be his domain. The Leshy has never had the same mainstream popularity as vampires or werewolves, but maybe that's fitting. He doesn't belong in the spotlight, he belongs just out of sight, hidden in the trees, waiting for you to wander too far. But beyond just media appearances, there's something else about the Leshy that refuses to die. Because at its core, the Leshy has always been a guardian of nature, a spirit who punishes those who take too much, who warns against greed and recklessness. In a world where we're watching forests disappear, where climate change and deforestation are very much real threats, his story suddenly feels very relevant. Some environmental groups in Eastern Europe have begun using the Leshy as a symbol of nature fighting back, a reminder that if we don't respect the land, the consequences will be severe. Maybe he won't come for us with clawed hands or glowing eyes, but the message remains: if you take too much from the forest will take something from you. And that's the thing about folklore. It doesn't just vanish when people stop telling the stories. It adapts. It finds new ways to creep into our minds, into our fears, and into the world around us. The Leshy may not be luring lost travellers in the woods like he once did, but in a way, he's still out there. And just like that, we find ourselves at the edge of the forest once more, looking back at the winding paths we've taken through stories, history, and whispers of something just beyond the trees. The Leshy is one of those legends that lingers, not just because of the eerie tales or the warnings passed down through generations, but because there is something about him that still feels very relevant. Maybe it's the idea that the wild world has a will of its own. Maybe it's just the thrill of knowing that some mysteries still haven't been unravelled. Whatever the reason, the Leshy has earned its place in the great library of folklore. A spirit of the forest, a trickster, a guardian, a warning, and now he is part of our collection too. And if you enjoy this journey through the tangled roots of mythology, consider joining the LoreKeepers Library by liking, subscribing, and sharing the stories with others. Every time you do, you are helping to keep folklore alive, ensuring that the old tales don't fade into obscurity. Because myths, like forests, thrive best when they're explored. And with that, I leave you with one final thought. Whether you walk through ancient woodlands or city streets, whether you believe in spirits or just the power of a good story, never lose your curiosity and keep exploring the world with wonder.